subscribe to my channel. Thank you.
Welcome to our AWS Lambda interview questions and answers session. This is the part 3. How can you secure AWS Lambda functions that are used in public-facing web applications to prevent unauthorized access or abuse? Answer: to secure AWS Lambda functions in public-facing web applications, you can use Amazon API Gateway to handle authentication and authorization, implement fine-grained access control using AWS IAM, and set up Web Application Firewalls (WF) for additional security against common web threats. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for running GPU-intensive workloads, and how can you achieve this? Answer: AWS Lambda functions are primarily designed for CPU-bound workloads and don't support GPU-intensive workloads directly. To run GPU-intensive workloads, you may consider using Amazon EC2 instances with GPU support or AWS Elastic Inference. What is the AWS Lambda Extensions feature, and how can it be used to enhance the security and observability of Lambda functions? Answer: AWS Lambda Extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside Lambda functions. These extensions can enhance security and observability by providing additional visibility into function execution, enabling security agents, and collecting metrics for analysis. Dear viewers, we're excited to offer you a valuable resource, a PDF version of our exclusive questionnaire. Simply drop a comment below expressing your interest and subscribe to this channel. We'll send you a direct message with the download link. Can AWS Lambda functions be triggered by events from AWS CloudTrail logs, and what are the potential use cases for this integration? AWS Lambda functions can be triggered by events from AWS CloudTrail logs, allowing you to respond to AWS API activity. Potential use cases include monitoring and responding to changes in your AWS infrastructure, conducting security audits, and automating compliance checks. How can you implement AWS Lambda function versioning and aliases to facilitate safe and controlled deployments in your serverless applications? AWS Lambda function versioning and aliases allow you to create immutable snapshots of your code and create aliases that point to specific versions. This facilitates safe and controlled deployments by enabling you to roll back to a previous version or implement blue-green deployments. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for processing data in near real-time from Amazon SQS, Simple Queue Service? Answer: yes. AWS Lambda functions can process data in near real-time from Amazon SQS. You can configure Lambda to pull an SQS queue and process messages as they arrive, enabling near real-time data processing and event-driven applications. How can you optimize AWS Lambda functions for cost-effectiveness, especially when dealing with large-scale workloads? To optimize AWS Lambda functions for cost-effectiveness, consider strategies such as adjusting memory allocation to balance performance and cost, reducing execution time by optimizing code, managing and reducing the number of function invocations, using AWS Cost Explorer to analyze and identify cost-saving opportunities. What is the AWS Lambda Extensions feature, and how can it be used to enhance the monitoring and security of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda Extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside your Lambda functions. It enhances monitoring and security by enabling additional logging, security agents, and metrics collection for better visibility into function execution. Can you set up custom error handling and retries for AWS Lambda functions, and what are the best practices for handling errors and exceptions? Answer: yes, you can set up custom error handling and retries for Lambda functions by using try-catch blocks and configuring retry behavior. Best practices include logging errors, emitting error events for monitoring, using dead letter queues (DLQs) for failed events, and implementing appropriate back-off strategies for retries. How does AWS Lambda handle environment variables, and what is the recommended way to manage sensitive data like API keys or credentials in Lambda functions? AWS Lambda allows you to set environment variables, but they are read-only during function execution. To manage sensitive data like API keys or credentials, it's recommended to use AWS Secrets Manager, AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store, or AWS Identity and Access Management, IAM. Roles with restricted permissions for secure access. Can AWS Lambda functions access external data or services hosted on the Internet, and what considerations should be taken into account for such access? AWS Lambda functions can access external data or services hosted on the Internet. Considerations include security, network connectivity, and potential latency. You may need to configure VPC settings for Internet access or use NAT gateways to enable external connectivity. Can AWS Lambda functions access and interact with resources in different AWS regions or accounts, and how can you enable cross-region or cross-account access? AWS Lambda functions can access resources in different AWS regions or accounts. Cross-region access can be achieved by configuring your Lambda function to interact with resources in the desired region. Cross-account access involves setting up IAM roles and trust relationships between the accounts to grant permissions. What is the AWS Lambda function provision concurrency feature, and how can it benefit serverless applications with variable traffic patterns? Provision concurrency is a feature that allows you to pre-warm a specific number of function instances to handle traffic spikes and maintain low latency. It benefits serverless applications with variable traffic patterns by ensuring that sufficient resources are always available to meet demand. How can you implement custom error handling and retries for AWS Lambda functions, especially when dealing with unreliable external services or resources? To implement custom error handling and retries for AWS Lambda functions when dealing with unreliable external services or resources. Use try-catch blocks to catch and handle exceptions. Configure retry behavior with appropriate back-off strategies. Implement error handling and logging to identify and address issues. Consider using dead letter queues (DLQs) for failed events. Can AWS Lambda functions access on-premises resources or databases within a corporate data center, and what connectivity options are available? AWS Lambda functions can access on-premises resources or databases within a corporate data center using AWS Direct Connect, AWS VPN, or AWS Site-to-Site VPN. Setting up a virtual private cloud, VPC, with appropriate connectivity options is essential to establish secure connections. What is the purpose of AWS Lambda extensions, and how can they be used to enhance the observability and security of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda extensions are used to enhance the observability and security of Lambda functions by allowing the installation and operation of extensions alongside functions. They can collect additional metrics, log data, and perform security checks to provide better insights into function execution. Can you use AWS Lambda functions to orchestrate and automate AWS resource management, such as creating and managing EC2 instances or RDS databases? AWS Lambda functions can be used to orchestrate and automate AWS resource management tasks. You can create custom Lambda functions that make API calls to various AWS services to create, manage, or update resources like EC2 instances or RDS databases. What is the maximum execution time limit for AWS Lambda functions, and how can you handle tasks that require longer execution times? The maximum execution time limit for AWS Lambda functions is 15 minutes. For tasks that require longer execution times, you can use AWS step functions to break them into smaller, manageable steps. Alternatively, consider using AWS Fargate, EC2, or other long-running services for such tasks. How does AWS Lambda pricing work for functions that experience high traffic volumes and short execution times, and what considerations are important in this scenario? AWS Lambda pricing is based on the number of requests and the duration of function execution. In cases of high traffic volumes with short execution times, you should consider optimizing memory allocation and function performance to reduce costs. Additionally, monitor your usage and set up appropriate alarms to manage costs effectively. What is the AWS Lambda payload size limit, and how can you work with payloads that exceed this limit in your functions? The AWS Lambda payload size limit is the maximum size for the input or output payload of a function, which is typically 256 kilobytes. To work with payloads that exceed this limit, you can use Amazon S3 to store and reference larger payloads, passing a reference to the payload in the event. How can AWS Lambda functions be used to process and analyze data from third-party APIs or external services, and what are the key considerations for such integrations? AWS Lambda functions can be used to process and analyze data from third-party APIs or external services by making HTTP requests to those APIs. Key considerations include handling authentication, rate limiting, and error handling for the external services, as well as ensuring data security and compliance. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to trigger Amazon Elastic MapReduce (EMR) clusters or perform tasks within EMR workflows? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be used to trigger EMR clusters or perform tasks within EMR workflows. You can trigger EMR clusters using AWS step functions or by invoking Lambda functions through Amazon EMR event notifications. How can you secure AWS Lambda functions to prevent unauthorized access or abuse, especially in public-facing APIs? To secure AWS Lambda functions in public-facing APIs, use Amazon API Gateway for authentication and authorization. Implement fine-grained access control using AWS Identity and Access Management (IAM). Set up Web Application Firewalls (WAF) to protect against common web threats. Monitor and audit function usage with AWS CloudWatch and AWS CloudTrail. What is the AWS Lambda Extensions feature, and how can it be used to improve the monitoring and security of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda Extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside your Lambda functions. These extensions can be used to improve the monitoring and security of functions by providing additional visibility into function execution, enabling security agents, and collecting metrics for analysis. How does AWS Lambda handle error handling and retries for asynchronous invocations, and what is the default retry behavior? For asynchronous invocations, AWS Lambda automatically retries a function invocation twice with delays between retries. The default retry behavior is an exponential backoff with a base delay of 1 second, maximum of 6 hours, and a cap of 2,500 retries. You can customize retry behavior as needed. Can you integrate AWS Lambda functions with AWS step functions to create complex workflows? And what advantages does this integration offer? Yes, you can integrate AWS Lambda functions with AWS step functions to create complex workflows. This integration provides advantages like coordinating multiple Lambda functions and other AWS services, implementing error handling, retries, and conditional branching, visualizing and managing workflow executions through step functions. How can you optimize AWS Lambda functions for cost effectiveness, especially when processing large volumes of data? To optimize AWS Lambda functions for cost effectiveness when processing large data volumes, Adjust memory allocation for a balance of performance and cost. Optimize code for efficiency to reduce execution time. Consider using AWS Lambda provision concurrency. Analyze and manage the number of function invocations to control costs. What is the AWS Lambda function initialization process, and how can it affect the overall performance of a function, especially during cold starts? The initialization process in AWS Lambda includes setting up the execution environment, loading external libraries, and making connections. During cold starts, this process can add latency to function execution. To mitigate this, you can use provision concurrency or keep functions warm. Can AWS Lambda functions access resources in another AWS account, and how can you set up cross-account access? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can access resources in another AWS account by configuring IAM roles and trust relationships between the accounts. This allows you to grant permissions and access resources in a different AWS account. How does AWS Lambda pricing work when functions are executed as a result of errors or retries? AWS Lambda pricing is based on the number of requests and the duration of function execution. When functions are executed due to errors or retries, you will be billed for these executions as if they were regular invocations. What is AWS Lambda extensions, and how can it be used to enhance the observability and security of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside your Lambda functions. It enhances observability and security by providing additional logging, security checks, and metrics collection to gain better insights into function execution. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for tasks that require real-time, low-latency processing, and what is the primary use case for such requirements? AWS Lambda functions are better suited for event-driven, asynchronous processing. They may not be ideal for real-time, low-latency processing where sub-millisecond response times are required. Use cases for such requirements may involve services like AWS App Runner, AWS Fargate, or EC2 for more control over resources and lower latencies. How can you implement AWS Lambda function versioning and aliases to ensure backward compatibility and smooth deployments in your serverless applications? You can implement AWS Lambda function versioning and aliases to ensure backward compatibility by creating versions of your functions and associating aliases with them. Aliases are used to point to specific versions, allowing you to smoothly transition between different function versions and deployments. What is the AWS Lambda extensions feature, and how can it be used to enhance the security and observability of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside your Lambda functions. It can enhance the security and observability of Lambda functions by enabling security agents, collecting additional metrics, and providing more comprehensive insights into function execution. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to process and transform data in real time from Amazon S3 buckets, and how can this integration be implemented? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can process and transform data in real time from Amazon S3 buckets. You can set up S3 event notifications to trigger Lambda functions when objects are created or updated in the bucket. The Lambda function can then process the data as it arrives. What are the best practices for managing dependencies and libraries in AWS Lambda functions to optimize performance and minimize deployment package size? Best practices for managing dependencies and libraries in AWS Lambda functions include using AWS Lambda layers to reduce package size. Packaging only necessary dependencies to keep the deployment package small. Considering custom runtimes for greater control over dependencies. Periodically reviewing and updating dependencies for security and performance improvements. How can you ensure that AWS Lambda functions running in a virtual private cloud, VPC, have access to other resources within the VPC and on-premises? You can ensure that AWS Lambda functions running in a VPC have access to resources within the VPC and on-premises by configuring appropriate VPC settings. Attach Lambda functions to a VPC with associated subnets. Configure security groups and network ACLs. Set up a VPC peering or VPN connection for on-premises access. What is the maximum allowable deployment package size for AWS Lambda functions using the AWS CLI or SDK, and how can you handle larger packages? When using the AWS CLI or SDK, the maximum allowable deployment package size for AWS Lambda functions is 50 megabytes. To work with larger packages, you can use these tools to create and update functions with packages up to the size limit. Can AWS Lambda functions be triggered by custom application events or custom sources that are not natively supported by AWS? If so, how can you achieve this integration? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be triggered by custom application events or sources using custom integrations. You can set up AWS Lambda to be invoked via Amazon API Gateway with HTTP requests, or you can build custom event sources using AWS SDKs or SDKs provided by third-party services to trigger your functions. How can you set up monitoring and alerting for AWS Lambda functions to detect and respond to performance issues or errors in real time? To set up monitoring and alerting for AWS Lambda functions, use Amazon CloudWatch to collect and visualize metrics. Set up CloudWatch alarms for specific metrics. Configure Amazon Simple Notification Service (SNS) for notifications. Implement distributed tracing with AWS X-Ray for detailed analysis. What are the recommended practices for organizing and managing AWS Lambda functions in a large-scale serverless application to maintain clarity and organization? Recommended practices for organizing and managing AWS Lambda functions in a large-scale application include using naming conventions and tagging for easy identification, creating AWS Serverless Application Model (SAM) templates, grouping related functions by service or purpose, documenting functions and their dependencies. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for building and deploying machine learning models, and what are the AWS services commonly used for this purpose? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be used to build and deploy machine learning models. Commonly used AWS services for this purpose include Amazon SageMaker for model training and AWS Lambda for deploying models as endpoints or for model inference. What is the AWS Lambda Extensions feature, and how can it be used to improve the monitoring and security of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda Extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside your Lambda functions. It can be used to improve the monitoring and security of functions by enabling security agents, collecting additional metrics, and providing more comprehensive insights into function execution. Can AWS Lambda functions be triggered by custom events generated by external IoT devices or services? And what are the typical methods of integration for IoT data? AWS Lambda functions can be triggered by custom events generated by external IoT devices or services. Typical methods of integration include using AWS IoT Core, AWS IoT Events, or AWS IoT rules to route data to Lambda functions based on event patterns or topics. How does AWS Lambda handle concurrency when multiple invocations occur simultaneously, and what can you do to control or limit concurrency for a Lambda function? AWS Lambda handles concurrency by creating separate execution environments for each invocation. You can control or limit concurrency by setting the reserved concurrency option, which restricts the maximum number of concurrent executions for a Lambda function. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to process data from third-party message brokers or data streaming platforms, and what integration options are available for such use cases? Yes. AWS Lambda functions can be used to process data from third-party message brokers or data streaming platforms. Integration options include using Amazon Kinesis data streams, Amazon SQS, or custom event sources via Amazon API Gateway to trigger Lambda functions. What is the AWS Lambda concurrent execution limit, and how can it be managed to prevent overloading your account resources? The AWS Lambda concurrent execution limit is the maximum number of function invocations that can occur simultaneously in an AWS account. It can be managed by setting the reserved concurrency value for individual functions, which helps prevent overloading account resources and maintains predictable performance. How can you monitor AWS Lambda functions for performance and errors, and what tools and services are available for this purpose? You can monitor AWS Lambda functions for performance and errors using Amazon CloudWatch for metrics and logs, AWS X-Ray for tracing and analysis, and setting up alarms for specific performance or error thresholds. Additionally, you can use custom logging and error handling within your code. Can AWS Lambda functions interact with external databases or storage systems, and what are the common methods of integration for data retrieval and storage? AWS Lambda functions can interact with external databases or storage systems using various methods, including accessing Amazon RDS for relational databases, using AWS SDKs for communication with external databases, connecting to Amazon S3 for object storage, utilizing Amazon DynamoDB for NoSQL database access. What is the AWS Lambda extensions feature, and how can it be used to enhance the security and observability of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside your Lambda functions. It enhances the security and observability of functions by enabling security agents, collecting additional metrics, and providing more comprehensive insights into function execution. How can AWS Lambda functions be used to implement serverless microservices, and what are the key advantages of this architecture for building scalable and loosely coupled applications? AWS Lambda functions can be used to implement serverless microservices, offering advantages like scalability, cost efficiency, and loose coupling. Each Lambda function can represent a microservice that is independently deployable and scales automatically to handle demand. The architecture minimizes operational overhead and fosters rapid development. Can AWS Lambda functions be triggered by custom events generated by external applications or systems, and what are the options for integrating with these external sources? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be triggered by custom events generated by external applications or systems. Integration with external sources can be achieved through services like Amazon EventBridge, which allows you to set up event rules and custom event buses to route events to Lambda functions. What is the AWS Lambda Dead Letter Queue (DLQ), and how can it be used to manage and handle failed invocations of Lambda functions? The AWS Lambda Dead Letter Queue (DLQ) is a feature that allows you to specify an Amazon SQS queue to capture and store failed event data for Lambda functions. It helps in managing and handling failed invocations by providing a destination for events that couldn't be processed successfully, enabling analysis and reprocessing. How can you implement AWS Lambda function concurrency controls to avoid overloading downstream resources, especially when integrating with services like databases or third-party APIs? You can implement concurrency controls for AWS Lambda functions using techniques such as Adjusting the reserved concurrency setting to limit the number of concurrent executions. Implementing back-off and retry strategies to prevent rapid retries. Leveraging resource policies and service limits for downstream resources. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to automate administrative tasks and operations within an AWS account? And what is the recommended approach for implementing such automation? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be used to automate administrative tasks and operations within an AWS account. The recommended approach is to use AWS Identity and Access Management (IAM) roles with the appropriate permissions to allow Lambda functions to perform administrative actions. Additionally, AWS step functions can be used to create complex workflows for automation. What is the AWS Lambda provision concurrency feature and how does it impact function performance and cost? The AWS Lambda provision concurrency feature allows you to pre-warm a specific number of function instances to handle traffic spikes and maintain low latency. It impacts function performance positively by reducing cold starts and can impact cost as you pay for the provision concurrency. How can you troubleshoot and diagnose performance issues in AWS Lambda functions, especially when dealing with complex applications with multiple functions and dependencies? To troubleshoot performance issues in AWS Lambda functions, use Amazon CloudWatch for metric analysis. Enable AWS X-Ray for distributed tracing. Implement comprehensive logging and error handling. Consider using AWS CloudTrail for tracking API calls. Review function execution durations and resource utilization. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to schedule and execute recurring tasks or jobs, and what is the AWS service commonly used for this purpose? AWS Lambda functions can be used to schedule and execute recurring tasks or jobs using the Amazon CloudWatch event service. You can create CloudWatch event rules to trigger Lambda functions at specified intervals for scheduled tasks. What is the AWS Lambda extensions feature, and how can it be used to enhance the observability and security of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda Extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside your Lambda functions. It can enhance the observability and security of functions by enabling additional logging, security agents, and metrics collection to gain better insights into function execution. How does AWS Lambda pricing work for functions that are in a suspended state, and what are the considerations when suspending or disabling functions temporarily? AWS Lambda pricing is based on the number of requests and the duration of function execution. When a function is in a suspended state disabled, you are not billed for execution time. Considerations include ensuring that the function can be safely disabled and understanding that you'll still incur charges for other AWS resources used by the function, such as EBS storage.
Hey, if you like the content, please subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a bite of Azure brilliance.